Ethan Carter took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day slip from his shoulders. He adjusted the rearview mirror in his sleek black sedan, the city lights gleaming off the car's polished exterior. The city was winding down, with fewer people on the sidewalks and an occasional flash of a taxi speeding through the late-night air. He'd been at the office later than usual, wrapping up a project he'd been working on for months. Just one more step, he thought, and this new venture could secure his family's future for years to come. It was a typical evening, until it wasn't. The street was nearly empty when a flash of red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror, jolting him out of his thoughts. Ethan's chest tightened, the lights burning into his vision like something out of a bad dream. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't missed a signal. So, why was he being pulled over? He pulled over to the side of the road, trying to keep his movements calm and deliberate. His fingers tapped against the leather steering wheel, trying to keep the unease from boiling over into something more. The officer approached slowly, each step deliberate, his form outlined by the street lamp's hazy glow. Ethan watched in the mirror, feeling a pang of unease as the man's heavy footsteps echoed on the pavement. Officer Derek Shaw, the officer's nameplate read. Shaw looked like he'd seen his share of rough nights and made his share of suspects regret they'd ever crossed paths with him. Ethan rolled down his window just halfway, as he'd learned to do. His father had taught him that. "Only halfway, son. You can't be too careful." "License and registration," Officer Shaw barked, his voice gruff with that familiar edge that Ethan had heard one too many times before. The officer's face held a look that Ethan had seen often, that faint squint of suspicion that trailed over his car, his clothes, and then his face. Ethan nodded, reaching over slowly to the glove compartment. As he handed his documents to the officer, he managed a polite, "Evening, officer. Was I speeding?" Officer Shaw looked down at the documents with an exaggerated pause, his mouth twisting slightly. "Ethan Carter, huh?" he said slowly, the name rolling off his tongue like he was tasting it, searching for some hidden meaning. He looked back at Ethan, his gaze shifting to the polished interior of the car. "What's a guy like you doing driving a car like this?" The question was one that Ethan had heard countless times before. It wasn't really a question. It was a loaded statement, wrapped in a flimsy guise. But tonight, as he sat in his own car, he felt the injustice of it gnawing at him a little more than usual. "I was just heading home from work," Ethan replied evenly, keeping his voice polite, careful. "And what kind of work is that?" Shaw's gaze remained on Ethan, his expression barely concealed disdain. Ethan could feel the weight of the man's eyes, as if they were trying to peel away something beneath the surface. Ethan's voice tightened. "I own a tech company. My registration's all there. Is there something wrong, officer?" Shaw's lips curved into a thin, almost mocking smile. "A tech company, huh?" He let out a small laugh, like it was a joke he didn't bother to explain. He let the silence hang in the air, a smug satisfaction flickering in his eyes. It took everything Ethan had not to respond, not to let the anger boiling inside him show. He'd worked too hard to build what he had, to let one bad moment tear it down. The silence grew heavy, pressing down on him, thick as molasses. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had rights, and he knew it. But he also knew that things could go horribly wrong in the blink of an eye. It had happened to others before him, and the stories haunted his memory, ghostly warnings in the corners of his mind. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Shaw shrugged, folding his arms across his chest, Funny thing about problems, Mr. Carter. They tend to find people who think they're above following orders. There was a glint in his eyes, a cold satisfaction in the words. With all due respect, I've complied with everything you've asked, Ethan said, his voice firm but respectful. I just want to understand if there's a reason for this stop. Shaw's gaze hardened, the faint trace of amusement vanishing. Oh, there's a reason, he replied, his tone dropping to something sharp and menacing. Step out of the car, Mr. Carter! Ethan's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment he'd feared, the moment where compliance could turn into something far worse. I don't see any reason to step out, he said, carefully maintaining his tone. I've provided you with my license and registration. I'm within my rights to remain in my vehicle. But Officer Shaw wasn't hearing any of it. He leaned closer, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. You think you get to decide what's necessary here? His voice was chillingly calm, each word dripping with a threat. I'm giving you a direct order, Carter. Step out! Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears, but he held his ground. I've done nothing wrong. I'm staying in my vehicle. The look that passed over Shaw's face was one of barely concealed rage. He looked up and down the street, his expression shifting as if he were weighing options, considering possibilities. Then, in a single, swift motion, Shaw brought his elbow down against the half-open window with a brutal force. The glass shattered, raining sharp fragments over Ethan's arms and face. He jerked back, feeling the sting of glass against his skin, the shock of it snapping him into a sharper reality. Before he could even process what was happening, Shaw's hand was reaching through the broken window, unlocking the door from the inside. He wrenched the door open and grabbed Ethan, dragging him from the car. Ethan's feet hit the pavement hard, his shoulder twisting painfully as Shaw forced his arms behind his back, the cold bite of metal clamping down on his wrists. The street was eerily quiet, the sound of Shaw's rough commands filling the empty space. Ethan felt the rough pavement beneath him, every inch of him tensing under Shaw's grip. Think you're above following orders, huh? Shaw hissed, his tone sharp, unyielding, filled with a cruel satisfaction. Think you're smarter than me? Ethan tried to stay calm, but disbelief and a growing anger mixed within him, bubbling up in his throat. I haven't done anything wrong, he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. This is excessive, and you know it. Shaw's grip tightened, his face twisting into a sneer. Oh, I know what's excessive, all right, he said, his tone dripping with satisfaction. And you've just earned yourself a taste of it. He marched Ethan to the squad car, each step feeling like an eternity. The reality of it, the humiliation, was sinking in with every painful step. Ethan cast a glance back at his car, at the shattered glass glinting like a scene from a nightmare. The cold dread of knowing that he was alone in this, that there was no one there to witness, to protect him, twisted his stomach. Shaw shoved him against the squad car, his voice a cruel mockery. Since you were so keen to stay put, I thought you'd enjoy the experience up close. Ethan's breaths came shallowly as he sat in the back seat of the squad car, hands cuffed, the sting of glass still prickling against his skin. Outside, Officer Shaw walked back to his own car, his stance triumphant, confident. A second officer approached, clipboard in hand. He gave Ethan a quick, indifferent glance before turning to Shaw. Another one? He asked, his tone barely interested. Yep, Shaw replied, his voice smug. Resisting, attempted flight, possession. Easy call. Ethan opened his mouth to protest, to shout that it was all a lie, but he forced himself to stay silent. He knew that anything he said now would only be twisted, distorted, used against him. In that dim, narrow back seat, he could feel his world shrinking, the air turning cold with the crushing weight of what lay ahead. This wasn't just a bad night. This was a descent into something darker, something that could cost him everything he'd fought for, everything he'd ever loved. And as the squad car pulled away, Ethan felt that first, sickening taste of despair settle like lead in his stomach. The life he'd known, the life he'd built with so much care and sacrifice, was crumbling before his very eyes. Ethan sat in the back seat of the squad car, his wrists sore from the tight metal cuffs digging into his skin. The city lights, which had felt like symbols of his success and the life he had built, now blurred past him through the window, like mocking glimmers of freedom slipping from his grasp. The humiliation, the fear, and the anger churned inside him, threatening to spill over. But he held it all in, his gaze fixed on the back of Officer Shaw's head as the car sped through the streets. He tried to make sense of the night, of how a simple drive home could turn into this living nightmare. He thought about his family, Sophia's laughter, the kids' bedtime stories, everything that felt distant now, as if separated by an unbreachable wall. When the car finally came to a halt, Ethan looked up, realizing they weren't at the main precinct. Instead, Shaw had taken him to a small, almost deserted station on the city's outskirts. It was old, worn, with faded bricks and dim lights, a place where stories like his could vanish into paperwork and shadows, buried by bureaucracy. Inside, Ethan was escorted to a cold, dimly lit room with walls painted a dull, institutional green that seemed to absorb any hint of warmth. Officer Shaw entered a moment later, a smug look on his face as he threw a folder onto the table, letting it land with a thud that echoed in the silent room. "Well, well, Mr. Carter," Shaw sneered, sitting down across from Ethan with a sense of satisfaction that made Ethan's skin crawl. "I don't suppose you'd care to confess now? Make this easier for both of us?" Ethan stared back, the heat of defiance simmering just beneath the surface. "I have nothing to confess, officer. I was pulled over for no reason, dragged from my car, and now I'm here because you planted something." Shaw's smile faded slightly, replaced by a steely glint in his eyes. "You know, Carter, people like you think you're above the system. You get a fancy car, a cushy job, and you think the rules don't apply to you. But I'm here to remind you, they do." The words landed with a cruel finality, and Ethan felt the icy grip of dread clawing its way up his spine. This man wasn't just targeting him out of a sense of duty or even anger. He seemed to relish every moment of this twisted power play. When Ethan didn't respond, Shaw leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I could make this very hard on you, Carter. Or," he smirked, "you could admit you were carrying. Maybe then we cut you a deal. 5 years, maybe 10, but at least you'd have a chance of getting out before your kids forget your face." Ethan clenched his fists, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. "I didn't have anything in my car. You know that as well as I do." Shaw let out a cold chuckle, his face twisting with disdain. "Well, if that's how you want to play it, then I'll enjoy watching you rot in that cell." With that, Shaw rose, leaving the room with a final, contemptuous glance. The door clanged shut behind him, leaving Ethan alone with the stark realization that he was up against a force much larger, much more insidious than he had anticipated. Hours passed. Ethan sat in that room, staring at the blank wall, his mind racing through every possibility. Who would help him? What could he do? Every avenue felt like a dead end. Every attempt to imagine his way out only deepened his despair. The life he had built, the sacrifices he had made, were slipping from his grasp like sand through fingers. The door opened again, but it wasn't Officer Shaw who entered. It was a younger officer with tired eyes and a clipboard in hand, barely looking up at Ethan as he went through routine questions, making it painfully clear that this was just another task, another box to check before the night was over. "Name?" the officer droned, glancing up only occasionally as Ethan responded. The formalities felt hollow, but Ethan answered each one, knowing it was futile, yet clinging to a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would see the truth. After the questions, the officer led him to a holding cell, pushing him in with a mumbled, "You'll be here till the morning." The door clanged shut, sealing him into a cold, confined space with nothing but a thin cot and a toilet in the corner. The darkness seemed to press in around him, echoing with his own thoughts, and he finally let his guard down, sinking onto the cot, burying his face in his hands. The next morning, he was woken by the loud jangle of keys as an officer unlocked the cell door. Ethan's heart leapt momentarily, hoping that maybe someone had come to their senses, that perhaps Sophia or his lawyer had found a way to reach him. But instead, he was led down a series of narrow hallways to a room crowded with other men, their faces as weary and worn as his own. The process was methodical, robotic, fingerprints, photographs, forms. He was processed like any other criminal, every detail recorded and logged. Each step stripped away another layer of his dignity, reducing him from Ethan Carter, the man with a family, a career, a life, to simply another case number in the system. After what felt like an eternity, he was granted a single phone call. He dialed Sophia's number with trembling fingers, relief flooding him when she answered on the first ring. "Sophia." His voice broke as he heard her gasp, followed by a rush of emotions on the other end of the line. "Ethan, are you all right? They told me you'd been arrested, but no one would give me answers." He forced himself to stay calm, though the sound of her voice was almost enough to break him. "I'm all right, for now. But Shaw's, he's trying to frame me, Sophia. He planted something in my car, and now they're talking about charges, possession, resisting arrest." Her voice grew stronger, each word laced with a fierce determination. "We're going to fight this, Ethan. I don't care how long it takes or what we have to do. I'm not letting them take you from us." A surge of strength flowed through him, her words grounding him, reminding him of everything he was fighting for. They only had a few minutes to speak, but it was enough to rekindle a spark of hope. As the line went dead, he held on to that spark, letting it chase away the cold dread that had settled over him. After another night in his cell, Ethan was finally arraigned, standing before a judge who barely looked up as the charges were read out loud. Each word a fresh blow, chipping away at his sense of reality. Shaw's smug face loomed in the corner, watching with that same twisted satisfaction, as if this were all a game, a sport for his own entertainment. Ethan's lawyer, Claire Donovan, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney with a reputation for fighting the toughest cases, met his gaze as the judge granted bail. She gave him a nod, a silent promise that she would stand with him through this. Outside the courthouse, Sophia waited, her face etched with worry and exhaustion. The moment he stepped out, she ran to him, wrapping her arms around him as if she could shield him from the nightmare they were living. Claire joined them, her face serious. "We have a long road ahead, Ethan. The charges Shaw's pushing are serious. I've already started gathering information, but this case, it's going to be a battle." Ethan nodded, a determined glint in his eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes." Claire looked between him and Sophia, her voice softening slightly. "You're going to need each other, more than ever. This isn't just a case for me. It's a chance to expose what people like Shaw get away with every day. But we need to stay strong, stay focused." Sophia's grip tightened on Ethan's arm, her gaze unwavering. "We'll fight. Together." And in that moment, standing in the shadow of the courthouse, Ethan felt something stir inside him, a strength, a resilience that he hadn't known he possessed. He'd been broken down, humiliated, and framed, but he wasn't alone. With Sophia by his side and Claire fighting for him, he knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that would push him to his limits, but would also prove the depth of his courage. They would face the system, face Officer Shaw and everything that stood in their way. And they would fight, not just for his freedom, but for the truth, for justice, and for every man and woman who had ever been made to feel powerless in the face of corruption. Ethan sat in his living room, feeling the weight of the ordeal settling into his bones. Sophia sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his, grounding him amid the chaos swirling in his mind. Across from them, Claire Donovan, his lawyer, had her laptop open, her face serious as she went through her notes. "We need a strong strategy," Claire began, her voice steady and reassuring. "Officer Shaw didn't just make an arrest, he fabricated evidence. If we're going to fight this, we have to prove that everything he did was premeditated." Sophia's hand tightened around Ethan's, her jaw set. "But how do we do that? He's covered his tracks so well. The planted evidence, the supposed resisting arrest charges, everything is designed to make Ethan look guilty." Claire nodded. "Exactly. That's why we're going to need more than just a defense. We're going to have to go on the offensive. We'll dig into Shaw's history, find anything that shows a pattern of misconduct, and build a case showing that he's targeted people like Ethan before." Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. "So, you think there's a chance?" Claire gave him a reassuring smile. "There's always a chance, but it won't be easy. The system protects people like Shaw. If we're going to win this, we'll need witnesses, solid evidence, and the public's attention. People need to see that this isn't just about you, Ethan. It's about a pattern of injustice." Sophia nodded fiercely, her determination shining through her exhaustion. "Whatever it takes, we'll do it. He's not going to get away with this." Claire spent the next few weeks delving into Officer Shaw's background. She combed through old arrest records, interviewed past witnesses, and reached out to former colleagues. Her efforts were meticulous, but information on Shaw was scarce. He was careful, covering his tracks and maintaining a veneer of legitimacy. However, just as she was about to hit a dead end, Claire stumbled upon an ex-officer named Tom Reyes. Tom had served alongside Shaw years before and had left the force after witnessing multiple instances of unethical behavior within his precinct. She arranged a meeting with him at a quiet cafe in the outskirts of the city. He was a wiry man, with graying hair and a wary expression, but there was a glint of anger in his eyes as he spoke about Shaw. "Shaw's been doing this for years," Tom said, his voice low. "He knows how to manipulate the system, how to twist a simple traffic stop into something far worse. He always seemed to target the same types of people too. Minorities, especially those who looked like they'd just gotten lucky with a good job or a nice car. It was like he resented them for it. Claire leaned forward, her pen hovering over her notebook. "Do you have any specific incidents that could be useful in court?" Tom nodded slowly. "There was one time, a young black man, freshly graduated from college, pulled over for a broken taillight. Shaw claimed he smelled marijuana and had probable cause to search. Found nothing, but the kid's reputation was ruined just by the suspicion. He lost a job offer because of it. And that's just one example. Shaw's got a real talent for pushing people to the edge." Claire's jaw tightened. She had found her opening, the key to revealing Shaw's dark pattern of behavior. If she could present these stories, weave together a narrative showing Shaw's history of racially motivated targeting, it could make all the difference. "Would you be willing to testify, Tom?" she asked, her voice hopeful. Tom hesitated, looking down at his coffee. "I've tried to stay out of this for years, but I can't stand by and let another man go through this. Not when I can help." He nodded, his eyes fierce. "I'll testify." As the legal battle began to intensify, Sophia decided it was time to rally support. She reached out to local organizations, activists, and media outlets, sharing Ethan's story with anyone who would listen. She knew they needed the public's attention if they were going to stand a chance. One evening, she attended a community meeting organized by a group dedicated to addressing racial injustice in policing. The room was filled with people from all walks of life: mothers, fathers, students, activists. As she took the stage, Sophia felt a surge of nervousness, but also a fierce resolve. She spoke about Ethan, his character, his achievements, and how he had been torn from his family by a lie. Her words resonated with the audience, and as she looked out into the crowd, she saw faces filled with empathy, anger, and solidarity. A young activist named Maria, a law student with a passion for social justice, approached her after the meeting. "We've heard stories like this before, but seeing you stand here, it makes it real," Maria said, her eyes bright with conviction. "I want to help. Let's bring this story to the community and make sure no one forgets Ethan's name." The community began to rally around Ethan's case, organizing marches, raising funds for legal expenses, and spreading his story on social media. Soon, justice for Ethan became a trending topic, with people from across the country sharing their support. With public support for Ethan growing, Claire expected retaliation, and she was right. The prosecution began leaking information to the press, painting Ethan as a potential criminal with a troubled past, twisting small incidents into sensationalized narratives to sway public opinion. Reporters descended on Ethan's home, snapping photos, asking invasive questions, and posting exaggerated headlines. It was a relentless barrage of misinformation, each article intended to tarnish his image and silence the movement Sophia had worked so hard to build. Ethan felt the pressure mounting. The pressure. Every time he opened his phone or turned on the news, he saw his face splashed across screens with headlines that distorted his life, his character, his truth. The system was fighting back, determined to crush him under the weight of its own power. Sophia stood by him, comforting him during the darkest moments, but Ethan felt the burden growing heavier every day. He knew this wasn't just a fight for his freedom, it was a fight for his dignity, his very identity. One night, Claire received a call from Eric, a tech-savvy friend who had been helping her dig through hours of surveillance footage from the area where Ethan had been stopped. His voice was excited, almost disbelieving. "Claire, I think I found something. There's a camera near a storefront close to where Ethan was pulled over. It doesn't show everything, but you can see Shaw reaching into his own jacket pocket and then moving his hand into Ethan's car." Claire's heart pounded as she watched the grainy footage. It was exactly what they needed. A visual, undeniable piece of evidence that could turn the entire case around. She forwarded the footage to Sophia, who watched it with tears of relief streaming down her face. The next day, Claire filed a motion to admit the footage into evidence. The judge initially resisted, but the public outcry surrounding the footage was too strong to ignore. The judge reluctantly allowed it, setting the stage for the beginning of Ethan's retrial. With the video footage as a crucial piece of evidence, Claire's team felt a renewed sense of hope. Claire began to refine their strategy, carefully piecing together a defense that would expose Shaw's lies, his history of misconduct, and the unjust system that allowed him to operate without consequence. Sophia, who had become a symbol of strength within the movement, continued to appear on talk shows, community forums, and social media, calling for accountability and justice not only for Ethan, but for countless others in similar situations. Ethan, though still confined by legal restrictions, felt the shift in momentum. His community, once fractured by fear and apathy, now rallied around him, filling him with the resolve to keep fighting. He knew he was not alone, and that knowledge gave him the strength to continue. As the date for Ethan's retrial approached, the movement surrounding his case grew larger. People from across the country came to show their support, joining marches and peaceful protests. Prominent public figures and activists lent their voices to the cause, amplifying the call for justice. News outlets began to cover the story from a more balanced perspective, showing the footage of Shaw's actions, interviewing Tom Reyes about Shaw's history, and spotlighting the human cost of Ethan's ordeal. The tide was turning, but the stakes were higher than ever. Ethan and Sophia knew that the battle was far from over, but they had come too far to turn back now. The love and support they felt from their community bolstered their spirits, helping them push through each grueling day. With Claire's expertise, Sophia's relentless determination, and a community that refused to stay silent, Ethan faced his retrial with a newfound confidence. He was ready, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been a victim of a broken system. In the weeks leading up to the retrial, Claire worked around the clock, meticulously crafting every part of Ethan's defense. She knew this trial wouldn't just be about proving Ethan's innocence, it was about dismantling the prosecution's case and revealing the truth about Officer Shaw's corrupt tactics. Her team spent hours in strategy meetings, reviewing the evidence from every angle and preparing Ethan for his testimony. Claire wanted Ethan to come across as the respectful, determined man he was, not as a victim, but as someone standing up against injustice with dignity and resolve. "Ethan, this trial is going to be intense. Shaw and the prosecution will do everything in their power to discredit you, but you have to stay calm," Claire warned him, her voice steady. "No matter what they throw at you, answer each question carefully. Show the jury who you really are." Ethan nodded, taking a deep breath. "I've waited for this moment, Claire. I'm ready to speak my truth." Sophia, sitting beside him, squeezed his hand. "And we're all here with you, Ethan. You're not facing this alone." As the date of the retrial drew closer, people from all over gathered outside the courthouse to show their support for Ethan. They held signs, lit candles, and shared his story with anyone who would listen. They chanted for justice, not just for Ethan, but for everyone wronged by the system. Sophia walked among the crowd, her heart swelling with gratitude and determination. The community had transformed, united by a common purpose. What had started as a story about one man's fight had become a rallying cry for change. Maria, the young activist, who had been by Sophia's side throughout the ordeal, spoke passionately to the crowd. Ethan Carter's story is one of many, but today we're standing together, not just for him, but for every man and woman who has ever been targeted, wrongfully accused, or silenced. Together, we're demanding accountability. The crowd cheered, their voices echoing down the street. Sophia felt tears prickling at her eyes. These people, many of whom she'd never met, were here, standing with her family, sharing in their struggle. She knew that whatever happened, this show of solidarity was already a powerful victory. The morning of the retrial dawned, tense and electric with anticipation. Ethan dressed in a dark suit, his posture composed, but his eyes reflected the weight of everything he'd endured. He glanced at himself in the mirror, taking a moment to center himself. Sophia, standing beside him, adjusted his tie and looked into his eyes. "You've got this," she whispered. "Remember, this isn't just about the case. It's about the truth. And we all believe in you." When Ethan and Sophia arrived at the courthouse, they were met by a wall of reporters and supporters. Cameras flashed, capturing every expression, every movement. But Ethan kept his gaze steady. He felt the weight of all eyes on him, the collective hopes of the crowd and the steadfast determination of his family. He wouldn't let them down. Inside, the courtroom was filled to capacity. Claire stood by Ethan, a quiet strength radiating from her as she reviewed her notes one final time. Today, they would face Officer Shaw, the prosecution, and a legal system that had once condemned him without question. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Ethan felt his heart pounding as the proceedings began. Cop de Claire approached the jury, her voice calm, yet filled with conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen, today you will hear the story of Ethan Carter, a man falsely accused, wrongfully arrested, and denied justice. This is not just about one man's innocence. This is about the truth, about exposing the abuse of power that led to his arrest." She gestured toward Ethan. "Ethan Carter has spent his life building a career, supporting his family, and giving back to his community. But on that night, he was targeted because of the color of his skin and the car he drove. Officer Shaw abused his power to fabricate a crime, and he did so with confidence, knowing he could get away with it." Claire's gaze sharpened as she addressed the jury directly. "This case will show you not only the truth about Ethan, but the truth about a broken system that allows men like Officer Shaw to operate unchecked. And we're here today to demand accountability." The prosecution looked unsettled as Claire returned to her seat. The room was silent, charged with the gravity of her words. Officer Shaw took the stand, his demeanor as confident as ever. He spoke calmly, recounting the events of the night he arrested Ethan, painting himself as a law-abiding officer doing his duty. The prosecutor, eager to establish Shaw's credibility, asked, "Officer Shaw, did you have any reason to suspect Mr. Carter of criminal activity before approaching his vehicle?" Shaw gave a smooth nod. Yes. Based on his behavior and reluctance to comply, I determined he might be hiding something. I was acting in the best interest of public safety. Ethan clenched his fists under the table, feeling the anger rise, but he forced himself to remain composed. This was Shaw's twisted version of the truth, one that Claire would soon dismantle. When it was Claire's turn for cross-examination, she approached Shaw, her gaze steady and piercing. "Officer Shaw," she began, her voice calm, "on the night you arrested Mr. Carter, were you aware that he had provided all the required documents and was fully cooperative?" Shaw hesitated, his confidence faltering slightly. "Well, he was reluctant." "Reluctant?" Claire pressed, her tone sharp. "Or was he simply asking for clarification on why he was being stopped without any apparent reason?" Shaw shifted in his seat, his demeanor cracking under Claire's unrelenting questioning. She went on to show inconsistencies in his story, revealing gaps that painted Shaw as an aggressor rather than a protector. Then Claire played the surveillance footage, which showed Shaw reaching into his own pocket before placing something in Ethan's car. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the reality of Shaw's actions became clear. "Officer Shaw," Claire said, her voice cold with disdain, "can you explain to the court what you were doing in this footage?" Shaw looked away, visibly uncomfortable. He mumbled an answer, but it was clear to everyone that his credibility was shattered. When it was time for Ethan to testify, he walked to the stand, his heart racing. He looked at the jury, then at Sophia, who gave him a reassuring nod. Claire's voice was soft as she began questioning him. "Ethan, can you tell us, in your own words, what happened that night?" Ethan took a deep breath, his voice steady. "I was on my way home from work. I was tired, but looking forward to getting home to my family. When I saw the lights behind me, I pulled over immediately, thinking it was just a routine stop. But when Officer Shaw approached, I could feel his suspicion, his disdain." He described the encounter, his voice laced with both pain and dignity. He recounted how Shaw shattered his window, dragged him out of the car, and humiliated him, all without any cause. The courtroom listened intently, some jurors visibly moved by his story. "I knew I hadn't done anything wrong," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I've worked hard my whole life to build a life for my family. But in that moment, none of it mattered to Officer Shaw. To him, I was just a criminal, someone who didn't belong in the car I was driving. He looked at me and saw a threat." Ethan's words resonated throughout the courtroom, each syllable a powerful indictment of the injustice he had endured. When he finished, the room was silent, a shared tension filling the air as his testimony sank in. After days of tense proceedings, the jury was sent to deliberate. The hours stretched into an excruciating wait, each moment charged with the weight of everything Ethan had been through. Finally, the jury returned, their expressions grave. The judge asked them for their decision, and the foreman stood, clearing his throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Ethan Carter, not guilty on all charges." A collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom. Sophia let out a quiet sob, holding Ethan's hand tightly, her face breaking into a radiant smile. Claire closed her eyes for a moment, a wave of triumph passing over her. Ethan felt the weight of months of fear, anger, and despair lift, replaced by a feeling of overwhelming gratitude and justice. But the judge wasn't finished. "Officer Derek Shaw, you are hereby placed under investigation for misconduct and evidence tampering." The court has determined that your actions have violated the law and the principles you swore to uphold. Shaw's face turned pale, the smug confidence draining away as he was led out in handcuffs. The tables had turned. Justice had finally caught up with him. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in celebration. Supporters cheered, people embraced, and tears of joy and relief flowed. Reporters clamored for a statement, and Ethan stood before them, his voice clear and unwavering. "This isn't just a victory for me," he said, his gaze scanning the crowd. "It's a victory for every person who has ever been wrongfully accused, targeted, or made to feel less than they are. Today we've shown that justice can prevail, but we still have work to do. This is only the beginning." He looked over at Sophia, who smiled back at him, and he knew that finally they could move forward together, stronger than ever. As Ethan and Sophia walked away hand in hand, they left behind the courthouse, but carried with them the resilience and unity that had seen them through. Their journey had been painful, but they had emerged with a renewed purpose: to stand up, not just for themselves, but for a better, fairer future for all. Months had passed since the trial, yet the memory of that final day in court lingered in Ethan's mind like a heartbeat, steady, persistent, a reminder of the price he had paid for justice. Ethan and Sophia had finally reclaimed their lives, and each day was filled with a quiet gratitude. They went on walks together, had meals without the shadow of worry hanging over them, and rediscovered the simple joys of family life. For the first time in months, laughter filled their home again. Their children seemed to sense the change, their faces brighter, their questions about Daddy's work replaced by simple joy in having him home. But beneath the peace was a simmering purpose. The trial had changed them, and neither Ethan nor Sophia could ignore the feeling that they'd been given an opportunity, not just to heal, but to make a difference. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset, Sophia turned to Ethan, a thoughtful look in her eyes. "What if we started something, Ethan? What if we used everything we've been through to help others facing the same nightmare?" Ethan nodded slowly, a quiet resolve building in his chest. "I've been thinking about that too. All those people who stood by us, who marched, who raised their voices, they're still out there. And there are so many people like me, people who don't have a Claire or a Sophia to fight for them." In the following weeks, Ethan and Sophia poured their energy into creating the Carter Foundation for Justice and Accountability. They used the donations and public support they had received during the trial to establish a non-profit dedicated to providing legal aid, resources, and support for individuals wrongfully accused or facing discrimination within the criminal justice system. The foundation quickly grew. Volunteers from their community offered their skills, local attorneys joined as pro bono advisors, and survivors of injustice came forward to share their stories. The foundation didn't just provide legal aid, it also advocated for reform, hosted educational seminars, and worked to increase awareness about systemic injustice. For Ethan, this work became a way to transform his suffering into something that could inspire and protect others. The foundation's first case came just 2 months after it was established. A young man named Jordan Matthews had been wrongfully detained for a minor offense that was quickly exaggerated, almost mirroring Ethan's own story. His family, lost in the legal maze, reached out to the Carter Foundation, desperate for help. Ethan met with Jordan's family, listening to their fears, their frustrations, and their desperate hope. Sitting with them, he was reminded of his own family's suffering, the sleepless nights, the gnawing uncertainty. He knew he couldn't turn his back on them. With Claire's guidance and the Foundation's resources, they were able to secure Jordan's release. His charges were dropped, and his record cleared. When Jordan hugged him, tears in his eyes, Ethan felt a surge of pride and gratitude. This was the beginning of something greater than himself, a new legacy built on resilience and justice. Word of the Carter Foundation spread quickly, gaining national attention. Soon, the foundation was partnering with other civil rights groups, advocating for legislative changes to prevent misconduct and increase police accountability. They worked tirelessly, speaking at universities, holding forums, and lobbying for policy changes. Ethan and Sophia became voices for justice, invited to speak at conferences and community events. Ethan shared his story over and over, not as a tale of victimhood, but as a testament to the power of truth, love, and community. Together, they inspired others to stand up, to believe that change was possible. The foundation became more than just an organization. It became a movement. People across the country rallied to the cause, sharing their own experiences and joining the fight for a fairer system. The network of supporters grew, a tapestry of people unified by a common purpose. Back home, Ethan and Sophia's family found their own way to heal. Their children grew up with the knowledge of their father's strength and resilience. They learned early on that justice wasn't something that came easily. It was something you had to fight for. As the years went by, the foundation became part of their family's identity, and Ethan and Sophia taught their children to stand up for what was right, no matter how difficult it might be. One evening, after a long day at the foundation, Ethan and Sophia sat together on their porch, watching their children play. The air was calm, filled with the sound of laughter, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. "Do you regret it?" Sophia asked, her voice soft. Ethan shook his head, a smile on his lips. "No, it was hard, and it cost us so much, but I wouldn't change it. I think everything we went through brought us here, gave us purpose." Sophia took his hand, resting her head on his shoulder. "Then we'll keep fighting, for everyone who needs us." They sat together in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon, filled with hope and a quiet, unbreakable determination. In that moment, Ethan knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, with a purpose as strong as the love that had carried them through. They had transformed their pain into strength, their fear into action, and their story into a legacy that would echo through the lives they touched. A legacy of justice, hope, and unyielding resilience.